Welcome back to another video. Today we are talking a little bit more about Insurgency. My last Insurgency video that was about the modding of your Insurgency game actually seemed to do pretty well, and a lot of people showed interest in seeing more Insurgency videos on the channel. So if you're here from that video, thank you a lot for your support. In this video, we're going to be checking out the suppression mechanic and analyze how that can be used in conjunction with the light machine guns that are currently available in the game. Now, we'll primarily be taking a look at how this mechanic can be used successfully, mostly in the sustained combat game modes, because if used properly in conjunction with good teamwork, then this can actually be very much so a game-changing technique that can very easily grant your team a victory. So if you've played some Insurgency, then you'll probably have experienced the suppression mechanic yourself before. This is pretty much what happens when a bullet whizzes barely by your character, doesn't really hit them, but your character gets spooked and panicked, and so your vision starts getting blurred, a lot of dust starts kicking up around you from the bullets hitting the dirt, your character is slowed, and your aim starts being disrupted, so you can't really shoot as accurately anymore, simulating really the panic that your character is experiencing at the time. So when we're trying to suppress, this is sort of the effect that we are wanting to apply onto our target. The best weapons for this technique are obviously going to be the M249 saw for the security forces and the RPK for the insurgent forces. And the only way to really acquire these weapons is to pick the support role in your squad selection menu. There are a few significant differences between the Security's M249 and the Insurgent's RPK, most noticeably being the mag sizes, where the M249 has a box that holds 200 rounds, the RPK only holds 75, and most of the time you're going to be carrying the heavy carrier rig, which allows you to carry double the amount of mags that you can hold. The M249s being 800 rounds in total, while the RPKs is only 300 rounds in total. On top of that, the M249's fire rate is higher, and the RPK's fire rate is lower, and I would suggest from these numbers that the M249 is pretty obviously the strongest weapon for suppression use, as the insurgents at the moment do not have access to a PKM, which would more or less tip the balance back up to where the security and the insurgents have about the same capabilities. However, I do believe that having the RPK on the insurgent side does make for some very interesting gameplay decisions where the insurgents will have to revert to using a different style of gameplay. Now, as a support gunner, you're obviously going to want to start moving as an element with your teammates. A lot of people nowadays don't really talk through comms, but by continuously putting rounds downrange towards the enemy, you don't really have the need to directly communicate with your team on voice comms if you don't want to do that, because your bullets are already going to be directing your teammates towards where you're really shooting at. So the strong point of these LMGs are not necessarily going to be the accuracy, but the volume of fire that you're going to be able to put out. So on the one hand, you have the point target fire, which is what usually riflemen do. You point your weapon at a target and you pull the trigger to kill the target. It seems pretty straightforward because in video games, that is mostly what we do. However, in Insurgency, that is not always what support gunners will be the best at. What support gunners are specialized in is area target fire. And what that does is they're not going to be specifically shooting or aiming and shooting at the targets, but they're shooting at the vicinity of the targets, specifically to take advantage of this suppression mechanic. Now, this mechanic can be used in a variety of ways, obviously. You can use it offensively when you are playing as the attackers. Suppressive fire is one of the most basic tactics used by the military at the moment, in the form of fire and move tactics. That means that one element sits in an advantageous position where they can put a lot of rounds downrange, keep the enemy's heads down behind cover so they're unable to organize, and the other element can start maneuvering around while the enemy is unable to return fire onto them. From that point, the second element that has just moved up can lay down their fire so that the first element previously shooting can move up. And this can be implemented perfectly in Insurgency to the point where your team can safely advance towards an objective. On top of that, a lot of times in Insurgency, you're going to be seeing people hiding in concealment. For example, bushes. When you're a support gunner that is laying down suppressive fire, those bushes become useless very quickly because as a rifleman, you would be using point target fire, which means you would be trying to shoot at the guy inside of the bush, while as a support gunner, you're going to be using area target fire, which means you're going to just be lighting up the entire bush with bullets. And as a result, you don't actually need to see the guy that is behind the bush, you just need to know that you need to light up the bush and the guy behind it will be dead anyway. This is a little bit different when we're not talking about concealment, but actually about cover. Now, cover is usually something that people hide behind that you cannot shoot through, right? The M249 and the RPK have a certain degree of surface penetration, which means that if you're shooting at walls, your bullets actually have a chance to penetrate that wall depending on the type of material, the angle that the bullet is hitting the material at, and stuff like that. So usually this can be relatively effective shooting through cover, but in Insurgency we have this thing called AP rounds, also known as armor-piercing rounds. This can be used to easily shoot through any sort of soft cover, and obviously that is why I would highly recommend this for any sort of MG gunner that is going to be suppressing the enemy. However, if you're primarily going to be point target shooting, which means shooting at your target instead of around your target, most of the time your target is going to be out in the open, clearly visible to you, and you're not going to have to be shooting through any materials. And so once you've really laid your sight onto the target, the fire rate of these MGs is so high that really no matter how much armor they're wearing, you're gonna just be hitting them with so many bullets that they'll drop down either way. Now, that is not to say that suppression cannot be used in a defensive manner. So when you are on the defensive team in Insurgency. As a defender, suppression can be used to pin down attackers, stop them from moving up, and on top of that, it is great to put psychological pressure onto the enemy, because if they know bullets are flying down that lane right over there, no player in their right mind is gonna think, all right, I'm just gonna book it right through that lane and hope that I don't get sprayed by the LMG. It's gonna restrict lane access for the attackers so that the objective becomes a lot harder to reach. Now, that doesn't mean that both offensively and defensively, this is not a dangerous playstyle. Don't get me wrong, this is probably one of the most dangerous playstyles in Insurgency for the reasons that you have to be relatively exposed in order to be consistently putting rounds down range. Specifically with the M249, where no matter really what ammo type you're using, in the belt that's feeding the rounds to the MG, every so many rounds are going to be tracers. So of course this can be positive in the way that your friendlies can follow those tracers down to the targets that you're shooting at, but at the same time, the targets that you're shooting at can also see where those rounds specifically are coming from, and they can trace those tracers back to their origin, which is you. And if you're laying out somewhere in the open or have found a good window to set up in, then they'll obviously know that you're there, and they might very possibly communicate that back to their sharpshooter or their sniper, in which case you'll be a very easy target to take down. It's also really not easy to fire this thing because of the incredibly high recoil that these LMGs have. A significant amount of downward force is needed to keep the weapon in check from bouncing up into the air way too high. That is primarily why we like to lay down prone onto the ground and deploy a bipod, or deploy it on top of some wall or inside of some window where we can support the weapon onto a surface so that it becomes a lot easier to handle. That is not to say that MGs cannot be fired without bipod, they most definitely are, but to maintain somewhat accurate groupings of bullets, you're going to have to be firing in very short bursts, which is obviously not as effective as if you would be able to set up your bipod somewhere. And next to that, of course, hip firing an MG is totally not recommended because your gun is gonna be kicking up so high that it becomes pretty much impossible to hit anything that is not within a small confined space along with you. MGs are also very heavy weapons, which means that they have a very long aim down sight time and that your character will get very tired very quickly if he has to run for a significant amount of time, in which case it will be even harder to aim straight if the bipod is not deployed. And in close quarters, these MGs have very long barrel lengths and they get stuck on walls very easily, so it is most definitely not recommended to take point with an MG to start breaching buildings. And lastly, as a support class, you obviously have a limited amount of supply points to spend on your equipment, and grabbing an MG is going to take up a significant amount, that being 4 supply points for an M249 on security. And it is going to be very tempting to take an enhanced battle rifle as a dedicated marksman because it takes up less supply points and it will grant you a lot more kills, being a dedicated marksman rifle that can take out targets from very long ranges very precisely. But what you really got to keep in mind is that these two weapons, being the DMRs and the LMGs, pretty much do the same thing, just in a different way. The DMR also moves with the squad, he also tracks targets on relatively long ranges and takes them out with precision, while an LMG does the same thing, except it doesn't have to rely on only targeting one enemy at a time. It can suppress an entire area filled with enemies and keeping their heads down, which might not always be as effective as killing them, but in a game like Insurgency, where respawns in sustained combat game modes are very prominent, having these enemies be stuck in a spot where they can't effectively counteract your forces can be a lot more effective than just taking out enemies one by one. I think a balanced team has both an MG as well as a DMR. And one should not be looked down upon more than the other simply because it doesn't rack up kills like the other. In my eyes, they are both very useful tools to the team if to be used in a slightly different manner from each other. And so as a result, if the support class is open next time you play Insurgency, I totally recommend you just grabbing one of the MGs and just trying it out for yourself and see if you can use this suppression technique successfully for yourself. If you do, please let me know in the comments below how that worked out for you, and I would be glad to hear the results. I'm always open to criticism, but first and foremost, I really do hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again in one of my next videos. Bye bye!